In the shadows of Constantinople's bustling hippodrome, a child's life began beneath the roar of the crowd. Theodora was not born to silk or to power, but to the dust and grime of the circus. Her father, a humble bearkeeper for the chariot faction of the Greens, scraped together a living by tending to beasts that entertained a city addicted to blood and spectacle. For a brief time, the family knew stability, but fate, so often cruel to the powerless, tore it away. When her father died suddenly, Theodora's world collapsed. She was only a girl, yet thrust into the brutal reality of survival. Her mother, left with 3 small children and no protector, turned to the only lifeline they knew: the hippodrome factions. She dressed her daughters in garlands of flowers and carried them before the mighty Greens, begging that her late husband's post be passed to her new partner so they might eat. But the Greens, proud and merciless, turned their faces away. The refusal was not just denial, it was humiliation. Before thousands of eyes, the widowed mother and her children were cast aside like beggars unworthy of pity. Desperation drove her to a rival power. She brought the children before the Blues, the Greens' bitter enemies. The Blues accepted, granting the family a fragile thread of survival. That choice, born of hunger and grief, would etch itself deep into Theodora's memory. From that moment, the Blues became not just patrons, but the faction with which her destiny would forever intertwine. Yet the child who clung to her mother's skirts that day could not yet imagine how those jeering voices, that rejection, and that fateful allegiance would shape the woman she would become, one who would rise from the dirt of the hippodrome to the throne of the empire. Theodora grew up in the underbelly of the hippodrome, a world where survival meant learning to perform, to please, and to endure. The Blues had taken her family in, but their generosity was no gift, it came with demands. For daughters of the circus, there was only one path: the stage. From her earliest years, Theodora was trained in the arts of spectacle. She learned to dance, to gesture, to captivate with her eyes. Her voice was sharpened for mimicry and biting wit, her movements crafted to draw both laughter and desire. It was a childhood not of innocence, but of performance and apprenticeship in a world where the line between entertainment and degradation was razor thin. The hippodrome was no sanctuary. It was an arena where women were commodities, their worth measured in applause, lust, and coin. To survive here, a girl had to shed fear, to wear masks that hid pain beneath charm. Theodora learned quickly. She mastered not only the craft of the actress, but the subtler art of bending an audience's gaze, of turning ridicule into fascination. Still, the life of a performer was cruel. Behind the painted faces and silk costumes lay a brutal truth. Every gesture, every smile was bound to the desires of men who saw women as ornaments for their pleasure. And yet, even as a child, Theodora carried herself with a sharpness, a spark that hinted at defiance. In the roar of the hippodrome, she was being forged not into a mere entertainer, but into something far more dangerous, a woman who would one day wield the power of spectacle itself. As Theodora grew, the stage became her prison and her throne. By her early teens, she was no longer a child in costume, but a young woman displayed for the pleasure of thousands. Theodora's beauty was undeniable: her sharp eyes, her striking presence. But in Constantinople, beauty was never left unclaimed. She was thrust into the spotlight, performing not only comic skits, but dances and pantomimes laced with provocation. Crowds roared, some in laughter, others in hunger, for in the hippodrome, entertainment often blurred into spectacle of the body. For a girl like Theodora, there was no shield from the gaze of men who saw her not as an artist, but as flesh to be consumed. Whispers spread of her daring roles, of performances that scandalized the pious and thrilled the depraved. To the elites of Constantinople, she was both mocked and desired, an object of ridicule who could not be ignored. Yet behind the veil of laughter and applause lay exploitation. The stage had given her a name, but it had also branded her, marking her as a woman of the theater, one society deemed forever tainted. Theodora endured, but the cost was steep. What dignity she possessed was constantly stripped away by those who profited from her youth. An allure, she played her part because she had no choice, but even then, something fierce stirred within her, a will not merely to survive, but to master the very forces that sought to break her. What others saw as shame, she would one day wield as a weapon. Amid the chaos of the hippodrome, Theodora caught the eye of a man whose power seemed to offer salvation. He was Hesebolas, governor of the distant Pentapolis in North Africa. To a girl scarred by exploitation and hunger, his attention must have seemed like deliverance, a chance to rise beyond the jeers of Constantinople's crowds. She followed him across the sea, leaving behind the filth of the circus for the promise of a new life. For a time, It seemed as though fortune had turned. Draped in fine clothes, kept in a governor's household, she walked through foreign streets no longer as a performer, but as a consort of influence. But promises born of desire rarely endure. To Hesperus, Theodora was no partner, only possession. His favor soured, his lust waned, and with it, her fragile security crumbled. In a land far from home, she found herself discarded, cast off as though she were nothing more than a broken toy. Alone and abandoned in Alexandria, Theodora faced the bleakest chapter of her young life. Stripped of protection, without wealth, and with no family beside her, she was forced to confront the cruel truth. Survival would always demand more of her than the world was willing to give. Yet even here, at the edge of despair, something within her refused to break. Theodora would endure. The humiliation meant to crush her would instead harden her resolve, for, though she could not yet see it, this exile was not an ending, it was the first step on a path that would one day lead her back to Constantinople, and to an empire she would claim as her own. From the depths of abandonment, Theodora clawed her way back. She made the long journey north, through harsh roads and hostile ports, until at last she returned to the empire that had once cast her aside. But she was not the same woman who had left. Hardship had carved steel into her spirit, and exile had stripped away her illusions. It was during these wandering years that Theodora's path crossed with a faith that would shape her future. In Alexandria, she had encountered the teachings of a sect of Christianity, one that preached endurance in suffering, humility before trials, and the strength of redemption. For a woman branded by scandal, these words offered something she had never known before, the hope of dignity. She abandoned the stage, renounced the life of performance, and turned instead to the quiet labor of spinning wool to survive. No longer paraded as an ornament, she worked with her hands, clothed not in jewels but in humility. To the world, it may have seemed she had fallen into obscurity, another discarded actress fading from memory. But Theodora was not fading. She was waiting. She was reshaping herself, shedding the mask that others had forced upon her. For behind the humble walls of her small dwelling, the fire within her only grew brighter. It would not be long before the eyes of power turned toward her once more, and this time, she would not be the one discarded. Fate moved swiftly. In Constantinople, where ambition ruled every street and whisper, Theodora's path crossed with the man who would change her life and the empire forever. His name was Justinian, nephew of the reigning emperor and heir to the throne. By the time they met, Theodora was no longer the girl of the hippodrome. She carried herself with a sharpened dignity, a presence born from suffering and survival. Justinian was captivated, not merely by her beauty, but by her wit, her intelligence, her unflinching will. She was unlike the women of the court, bold where they were cautious, fierce where they were silent. Their bond defied expectation. Theodora was a former actress, tainted in the eyes of the elite, unworthy of a man destined to rule. But Justinian saw in her something the aristocracy could not: a partner, an equal, a mind as formidable as his own. Against custom, against scandal, he made her his wife. When Justinian ascended to the throne, Theodora rose with him not as a consort in name alone, but as Empress of Byzantium. In the gilded halls of Constantinople, the former performer now sat crowned, her voice echoing in the councils of empire. She had endured hunger, humiliation, and abandonment, but none of it had broken her. Instead, it had prepared her. Theodora, once mocked from the stage, now ruled beside an emperor, and soon, the world would learn that her reign would be as fierce, as unyielding, and as unforgettable as the trials that had shaped her. Theodora's rise to empress was no coronation of peace. Constantinople simmered with unrest, factions, rivalries, and the ever-volatile crowds of the hippodrome. All of it exploded in 532 AD during what history would call the Nika Revolt. What began as a dispute between the Greens and the Blues erupted into a fury that shook the empire. For days, the city burned. Rioters stormed the streets, demanding Justinian's overthrow. The palace itself trembled under the weight of rebellion. In those desperate hours, Justinian faltered. Advisors urged retreat. Escape by sea, better to flee and live than to die in a crumbling capital. The emperor wavered, ready to abandon his throne. But Theodora did not. She rose before the council, her voice cutting through fear like a blade. She reminded them all that power is never safe, and that a throne once deserted is never regained. Then she spoke words that would echo through the centuries. Royalty is a fine burial shroud. For Theodora, death in majesty was better than life in disgrace. Her defiance rekindled Justinian's courage. The emperor stayed, and with brutal force, the revolt was crushed. Tens of thousands lay dead, but the throne endured, and in that moment, Theodora was no longer just Justinian's wife, she was the spine of the empire. Her will had saved Byzantium. Her resolve had forged legend. The Empress, once mocked on the stage, now commanded the fate of nations. With the empire secured in blood, Theodora began to shape Byzantium in her own image. She was no silent consort behind palace doors, she ruled as fiercely as Justinian, sometimes more so. Her heart carried the scars of her youth, and from them she carved a vision for change. She pushed for laws that protected women from exploitation, forbade the trafficking of girls, and granted wives more rights in divorce. For the oppressed, she became a rare voice of mercy, an empress who remembered what it was to be powerless. But mercy was not her only weapon. Theodora could be as ruthless as she was compassionate. Those who opposed her reforms, those who dared to challenge her authority, quickly learned the cost of defiance. She maneuvered with a politician's cunning, silencing rivals with intimidation, exile, or worse. Even within the church, her influence was undeniable. She championed causes, brokered alliances, and bent bishops to her will. Some saw her as a savior of the oppressed, others as a tyrant cloaked in piety. To her enemies, she was dangerous. To her people, she was unforgettable. Theodora ruled with the memory of hunger and humiliation still burning within her, and she would never allow herself, or her empire, to be at the mercy of others again. For all her power, Theodora could not escape the one force no ruler can conquer: death. In 548 AD, at the height of her reign, she fell gravely ill. Some claimed it was cancer, others whispered of a slow and wasting sickness. Whatever its name, it struck with relentless cruelty. The woman who had once defied mobs, who had bent emperors and bishops to her will, now wasted in her chambers. Yet even in her decline, she held herself with the same fierce dignity that had carried her from the stage to the throne. No tear, no weakness would be shown to those who waited for her fall. At just 48 years old, Theodora's reign ended. Justinian, devastated, lived on without her, but the empire was never the same. Her death left a void no courtier could fill, for she had not been an ornament of rule, she had been its steel. History remembered her in fragments, as a harlot, a saint, a reformer, a tyrant. But none could deny that Theodora, the girl once abandoned in the streets, had risen to command the greatest empire of her age. Her story is not one of purity or perfection. It is one of survival, of fire, of a woman who bent destiny to her will. And long after her crown turned to dust, her shadow lingered, an empress carved from suffering, immortal in defiance.